So Johnson could, as a Southerner, now see, this is interesting, because for all that time while Johnson was trying to get to be president, he wanted to downplay his Southern roots. He wanted to act as though he was a Westerner. And now, though, as president, when he's trying to get the South to change its system, all of a sudden he starts to sound more Southern. And this is where there was, some of you may have heard this or encountered it, but in an earlier generation, there was a pronunciation in the South of the word Negro that came out like Nigra, and just was right on that border between Negro and nigger. And if you said it just right, it could be interpreted whichever way suited your purposes. And Johnson mastered this. So when he was talking to the white supremacists, it came out sounding the way you would imagine. When he was talking to another audience, it came out sounding like Negro, which was acceptable. And this is emblematic of Johnson's ability to play the Southern card as well as to play the national card. Because what Johnson needed to do to the South was convince the South to enter the rest of the country, to get along with the rest of the country. Johnson's experience in the Senate was absolutely crucial here, because he needed to get the support of the Senate Minority Leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. And Dirksen was a conservative Republican from Illinois, which, certainly downstate Illinois, has a long history of being almost as Southern as much of the South. But Johnson was a master of what came to be called the Johnson Treaty. And this was Johnson working one-on-one against various legislators. And I really should stop and save this for a subsequent lecture, but since I've mentioned the Johnson treatment, I'll just tell you how it worked. Lyndon Johnson was a big guy. He was about 6'4". He was really rangy. He had long arms, had this big head, big nose, big ears. And he used to physically overpower people. He would invite them into the White House, to the Oval Office, which was intimidating enough as it was. And then he'd be kind of lounging behind his chair. He often would slump way down low in his chair, but when he really wanted to make a point, he'd rise up out of that chair. And just for an ordinary sized legislator, then he'd come in and sort of stand over them. and there were two versions of the Johnson treatment. There was the half Johnson and the full Johnson. The half Johnson, he'd put one arm around the poor legislator, and he would start thumping him on the chest with the index finger of his free arm. And if you watch the old TV show Seinfeld, there was an episode, a famous episode there on the close talker. You know the one about the close talker, the guy who talks too close? You know, we all have this certain sense of what our physical space should be. Well, the close talker would just invade that space. That's what Johnson would do. And you'd want to get away. Except Johnson would have his arm around you. And if the half Johnson didn't work, then you'd go to the full Johnson. This is both arms around you. And he's leaning down on you like this. And when Johnson got excited, spittle fly out of his mouth. And these poor imprisoned legislators, they would do anything to get out of his grasp. One more instance, then I will stop. Jack Valenti, who was a junior staffer in the Johnson administration, was invited to join the administration. Johnson wanted him to take on, so I can't remember what particularly difficult, distasteful task was. And so he invited Valenti down to the range, Johnson's ranch in Texas, the Texas Hill Country. And whether Johnson did this by design or it just sort of came instinctively to him is hard to say. Because with really natural politicians, the dividing line between what they're calculating and doing and what comes naturally is almost impossible to determine. Anyway, Johnson invites Valenti into the swimming pool. Now, Johnson had this habit of inviting people to go swimming, and they would say, well, sorry, I didn't bring a swimsuit. And Johnson would go, don't worry, we don't wear swimsuits around here. In this case, though, he said, no, okay, we got a swimsuit for you. So Valenti got in the pool. Johnson, I say, was a tall guy. Valenti's fairly short. Valenti is, I don't know, 5'8", something like that. And Johnson positioned himself in the swimming pool, in that place between the shallow end and the deep end, where he could stand with his feet on the bottom of the pool, but where Valenti had to tread water. And so Johnson kept telling him how important this was, and how his country needed him, and how he just wouldn't let him away from there until he said yes. And what it meant for Valenti was he was going to drown unless he said yes. And sure enough, he said yes. Anyway, the moral of the story is, if you're going to be a successful president, you have to have this sense of time. You have to know what's possible, not what's possible in the abstract, what's possible in the ideal world, but what's possible in the here and now, as you know. Healthcare reform is a big issue, at least on the Democratic side. And even John McCain is talking about healthcare reform. As you all know as well, Hillary Clinton was the head of a committee to try to propose healthcare reform in 1993. Healthcare reform in 1993 was an idea whose time had not yet come. We will find out, perhaps, next year whether the time has come. Will the difference be in the candidates? No, probably not. The difference will be in the electorate as a whole. So perhaps Hillary Clinton, if I'm going to focus on her, was maybe a whole step, and Bill Clinton were a whole step ahead of the country on healthcare reform in 1993. If they're going to be successful this time around, then whoever it happens to be might be a half step. Does that mean that the candidate has taken a step back? No, it means that the country has taken a half step forward, which is exactly the distance you want between the leaders and the followers. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you like. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the Electoral College, which you mentioned, because it seems to have a great influence on, first, who thinks they can run and succeed. Secondly, where they campaign. Some states would never see a candidate if we did away with the electoral system. We had, in 2000, of course, a very dramatic example of people really getting excited about all that. But then 9/11 came and they forgot about it again. Can you imagine any kind of earth-shaking event that would cause us to seriously confront the Electoral College system?
For years, for 20 years, I started teaching in the late 1970s. And from the late 1970s until 2000, I used to talk to my students about how the Electoral College originated. And isn't it this quaint vestige of an earlier time? In fact, the story, is that the framers of the Constitution were sufficiently distrustful of the electorate that they wanted the president to represent the country as a whole, but not be voted on by the country as a whole. And that's why the Electoral College was established. And the Electoral College was originally supposed to have independent views. Very much, it's on the order of senators and representatives. And so they would choose whoever they want. And I used to talk about how this was the way it used to be. It's not that way anymore. The only reason we still have the Electoral College is it's been 100 years since the Electoral College result differed from the popular result. But I said with glib confidence, well, as soon as we get a case where somebody wins the electoral vote and loses the popular vote, well, the Electoral College will be swept away within just a matter of months, because everybody will realize how anachronistic it is. Well, needless to say, I was wrong about that. I underestimated the appeal of the Electoral College for particular groups in politics today. And so I've thoroughly revamped my view. I think the Electoral College is very much anachronistic, and I think it's one of those institutions, and this is something I propose to my students. One way of assessing the value of an institution is, or a custom is, if the institution did not already exist, would anybody invent it today? And the answer to the Electoral College is no. It would never occur to anybody 150 years, 170 years after the embrace of democracy to think that electors somehow improve the selection of presidents. But that's one way of assessing the value of an institution. That's not the only way. The other way is, well, we got it, so what are we going to do with it? It's going to be very hard to change that system, because to amend the Constitution requires a very high threshold. You've got to get 2/3 of the both houses of Congress, and you have to get 3/4 of the states.